Hanna Tetteh of Ghana is the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa. She cares deeply about climate, peace and security, especially how they're connected and most especially about how they're protected in the Horn of Africa region. I'm delighted to say that she joins us now. It's very good to see you. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. What I'd like to know is a little bit more about your role, what it is that you do and how your passion informs that.
Thank you for having me. The role of the UN Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa is a role that focuses more on the political peace and security challenges of the region. The region covers the area that involves member states of IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. And so basically we're talking about 8 countries: Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, Sudan, South Sudan, and Djibouti. And within this very diverse region, which we refer to as the Greater Horn of Africa, you have some of the countries that are on the forefront of the climate crisis. And when I say forefront of the climate crisis, you can see the impact on countries, on communities, and on their development trajectory. And even though climate change is not necessarily a trigger of conflict, it can create the situation that causes tensions between communities that ultimately, if those tensions are not well managed, then they can drive existing conflicts or start new ones.
So it can actually complicate things, basically.
Yes.
I mean, I do want to look at the impact of climate change on these communities, but before we go there, I want you to explain to me the link between climate and security, because as somebody who works in the media, it is a connection which is either ignored or under-explained.
Well, if we bear in mind that the climate crisis, being that this is a man-made crisis, essentially is a trigger of security challenges globally, then that's our starting point. And that's not necessarily within the Horn of Africa. But within the Horn, especially with the countries that I've just mentioned, you've seen this manifesting in different ways. So for instance, in the area between Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia, referred to as the Mandera Triangle, we've seen 5 years of consecutive drought. 5 years of consecutive drought in communities that are pastoral. And so essentially what that means is that their animals no longer have food and water. The areas in which they used to graze are no longer fit for that purpose. The pressure is going to create climate migrants. When they move into other communities and have to change their lifestyle from the economic activity that they have been used to for a very long time, and now try to adapt to other things, that in and of itself creates its own difficulties. And so if you just take that intersection between these 3 countries and you see what has happened over the last 5 years, and by the way, it doesn't look as if the next rain from the prognosis that we have so far is going to be any different. Can you imagine what that happens going forward when you don't find ways of bringing into play adaptation, resilience building, and alternative livelihoods? When people have no choices, what do? They begin to fight over the little that they have left.
You actually answered the question I was going to put to you about the impact on communities, so thank you so much for explaining that. But what happens if we don't take meaningful action now? We can talk about it, but the words have to have substance if we're to avoid the disaster scenarios.
Well, that's the reason why the UN Secretary General says that we should understand that we are in a crisis situation and we are failing at addressing that crisis, and which is the reason why we need to bring more seriousness to this issue. Because what you're seeing in the Horn is on the front line of people who have been impacted. Now, I know that last year, because of the floods in Pakistan, that is what is in the public's memory about what the climate crisis can cause to countries, and indeed has caused to Pakistan. But it's manifesting in different ways in other parts of the world. And on the African continent, in the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel belt, this is where you're seeing the same kind of crisis, the same kind of tragedy unfolding in a different way from what happened in Pakistan. So the creation of the new fund to deal with issues of loss and damage is timely, is necessary, because the loss and damage is happening today. Now, I've talked about the areas in my region which are facing drought, but on the flip side, in South Sudan, You can see now that the way in which the crisis has manifested there is extensive flooding. That hasn't had the same kind of airtime as the situation in Pakistan. But there are states within South Sudan, which is a country that in itself is transitioning and trying to move out of conflict, where last year's rainwaters have not receded. And so communities that used to be agricultural, again, some that used to be pastoral, are not able to access the resources they have lived on. That's the urgency of now. And that's why this has to be dealt with now.
That's the point as well, that basically the environment or environmental concerns are feeding into geopolitical tensions from which nobody benefits effectively. That's what it's all about.
Absolutely.
But in terms of initiatives that are happening within the Horn of Africa itself, are there things which are really getting you excited and which make you feel that perhaps this negative tide can be reversed?
I must say that many of the countries in the region, Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, are dealing with this problem themselves. I mean, they've started to deal with it from a perspective of government policy and investing resources. But the resources available are not enough to meet the scale of the challenge. The member states of IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development themselves, last year at a side event that we co-organized, we meaning the United Nations, my office, co-organized with IGAD on dealing with the climate crisis, agreed to establish a coordinating mechanism in order for them to be able to exchange across the region, because this is not an issue that respects national borders, so that there can be a regional response. And so one of the things that we want to look at this year is to crowd and finance for that initiative, so that the member states that have been proactive can deal with it. In Ethiopia, for instance, over the last 4 years, we've had the Green Legacy Initiative of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, where they focused on reforestation in a major way. And you can see that it is beginning to impact weather systems in a positive way. So it tells you that once you apply resources to try to work towards real solutions, you actually can effect change. And I think that's the most promising thing about this whole situation. We can make a difference if we pay attention now.
And let me stay with the idea of actually making a difference, because you are a highly experienced negotiator at regional, national and international level. So how do you think you can bring those skills to bear at Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week and going forward to help build that consensus and drive for the COP28? We talk about cooperation. How can we achieve that given these monumental events which are happening right now and also further down the line? What can you do to make that difference?
Well, one of the things that we have done, and we started with COP27, was to make sure that we were able to work with the countries to bring them together to have a consensus on this initiative. For the rest of this year and beyond, I am going to continue on making sure that that agreed initiative begins to get the attention of international donors and funding partners, so that we can make sure that some of the key projects that we have developed under that initiative already can attract the financing to be able to implement them. Because we can talk about doing things, of course you need to have an appropriate coordinating framework. The hard part of getting member states to accept that and to see the benefit of that has happened already. So now it's about making sure that the things that we talked about, the things that we identified, now it's to deliver on actually making them happen.
I have a feeling that you will, but Hanna, we have to leave it there. That was Hanna S Tetteh of Ghana. She is the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa.